So last week, we talked about what story do we live out of. And we looked at what it means to have a renewed imagination and how that will rewrite the story that we live out of. And today, we're going to look to the past for an instance of this renewed imagination. And we're going to look to the life of 19th century wife and mother turned activist, Josephine Butler. And we're going to see how her imagination was changed by reading this story. And it's going to be a pretty in-depth look because the breadth of her story will ask us some big questions. So today's sermon, you'll find it's kind of in three parts. There's part biography, part a look at a text, and then the last part is a call, and I think kind of a summary of everything we've been talking about for the last 3 months. Maybe we can hear that call and a challenge as this community of people here in Northwest Calgary. But anyways, Josephine Butler. She was born Josephine Gray in 1828 to an upper-class family in Victorian England. She was very lucky. She was loved, and she was educated, and she was cared for. She grew up, and she married George Butler. And when they were first married, they moved to Oxford for his work. He was an examiner. He wanted to be a professor, but he was just working as a tutor or an examiner. They would study together in the evenings. They would read scripture and poetry and philosophy to each other and invite their friends to talk about it. This was in the days before Netflix, apparently. And it was during this time early in her marriage in Oxford, that Josephine really began to see this double standard. And she started to notice that how men and women were treated in public was very different. She wrote in her journals about something that happened on the campus. So a young servant girl in one of the colleges, she was seduced by a professor that they knew. And this girl ended up pregnant and with child. And she was then summarily dismissed from the college, unemployable. She couldn't go home, and therefore she was sent to a workhouse. And more on workhouses in a little bit. But Josephine tried to talk to an older professor to see if they should try and get this man to take responsibility for abandoning this girl and her child, and she was strongly advised to do nothing, and she was told it could only do harm to open up in any way such a question as this. It was dangerous to arouse a sleeping lion. She looked at the people around her in her social circle, men training to be the next generation of politicians and clergymen and teachers, lawyers, doctors, and she was deeply troubled. Silence, she wrote, was thought to be the great duty of all on such subjects. Josephine and her husband George had 4 children, the last being a girl they named Evangeline, which I didn't know until I started looking to it. My daughter's name is Evangeline, so it made me love Josephine even more. But when their daughter was 5, she fell over the banister from the 2nd floor in their home in front of her brothers and in front of Josephine and George, and she died a few hours later. And the grief was overwhelming for Josephine. And luckily, she wrote in her journals a lot, so we know. And she reveals that she experienced what we would probably call now pretty severe PTSD, where she would wake up every morning reliving her child's fall and death every morning for probably about 30 years, she said. But at the same time, in the years following her daughter's death, a strange thing happened, and she started to understand and experience her grief amidst the grief that she saw in the world. She started to see that the way God met her in her grief was the way God met the grief of every individual in the world. And this was Josephine's entrance into deep compassion, which literally means suffering with. So her broken mother's heart was able to enter the world of those who hurt and to find God exactly there. She wrote, I became possessed with an irresistible desire to go forth and find some pain keener than my own. I did not exaggerate my own trial. I only knew that my heart ached night and day, and that the only solace possible would seem to be to find other hearts which ached night and day. I had no clear idea beyond that, no plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of some human misery and to say to afflicted hearts, I understand, I suffer. She didn't go out with a plan to fix the world. She went and found hurting people and sought to just be with them. And that gives me pause. It makes me wonder, do I help? Do I want to help fix because I have answers? Or do I want to help because I am living with others and I need answers just as much as they do? Now, in Liverpool, where the Butlers lived by now, living with hurting people was not very hard to do. Josephine made her way to the Brownlow Hill Workhouse, where up to 5,000 inmates were housed and worked. Workhouses, if you've read Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, that's a story about a boy born in a workhouse, so there might be some familiarity there. But workhouses, like where the servant girl and her child were sent, they really were where homeless, paupers at the time were sent there, and they worked in exchange for room and board. It was the poverty strategy of the time. They were known as prisons without crime. Josephine went to this one workhouse, and she went to the oakum sheds of the workhouse, which were cellars where the poorest women, which were often unwed mothers with no way to make money for themselves, or prostitutes, they worked there picking apart old ship ropes coated in tar, and they would pick out the fibers, and that was their job all day. So a month before Josephine went into these cellars for the first time, the matron of that workhouse, she actually had been murdered by the woman in the oakum cellars, and those murderers were still there in the oakum cellars waiting their trial. The new matron, Josephine says, "I want to come and work in the cellars." The new matron opens the door, pushes Josephine, shuts it, locks it. And Josephine writes in her letters to her sister that she stayed at the top of those stairs for a long few minutes, and she prayed. And then she went down, and she didn't say a word to these women, and she started picking the oakum with them. And the women down in the cellar, they surround her. They're curious about her, why she's there, why is she wearing such fancy clothes? No one would come there if they didn't need to be there. And then some of the women started to laugh at her, and she let them, and she laughed with them. It was ridiculous that she was there. And for some reason, trust was born. And she eventually befriended these women, and she visited regularly, and she got to know them. And this started her life spent with the forgotten women, or as she called them, the outcast of their society. These were the women who, for whatever reason, were absolutely relegated to the sidelines of society. It was not proper for Josephine to be there. These were criminals, they were paupers, they were runaways, they were unwed mothers, they were women who sold their bodies to eat. But Josephine was there not preaching, just helping them pick oakum in the dark cellars. And Josephine quickly realized that the only thing lower than a prostitute or an unmarried mother or a convict in a workhouse was a sick and dying prostitute or unmarried mother or convict. And when they were too sick to work and they were dying, they were then sent away from the workhouse, left to die on the streets. And so Josephine did what seemed perfectly normal to her. She would go around and she would find these dying women. And she eventually started to bring them to her house to live and to die there. And she did that in her own home for many years, and she eventually founded a house of rest, she called it, for dying prostitutes. It's interesting that the only other institutions like that at the time were run by the Church of England, and they were called the penitentiaries, the houses of penitence. From her letters and other documents, this is a letter from Josephine to her son. You can't really read it, but it's there. We know of one such woman named Mary. So Mary was a farmer's daughter who got a job as an underservant at 15 in the big house that her dad was a tenant farmer on. And one day, the gentleman of the house sent her up to his room to get a cigar case, and he followed her, and he shut the door, and she was attacked at 15, and she got pregnant. And then she was dismissed from that big house, and she was sent home, which brought much shame on her family. Her family concealed her. They sent the baby away when it was born, and they treated her very harshly. And Mary ran away, and she came to Liverpool with no money and eventually ended up in a brothel. She was quite a popular commodity, according to Josephine's story. She brought a lot of money to the owner. Mary eventually became consumptive and got very sick. And when the clients complained, she was tossed out on the street, coughing blood, and that's where Josephine found her, on the doors outside of the workhouse, and she brought her to her house. Josephine recounts a story about how when they read to Mary from the Bible, her and her husband, after a couple of weeks of living there, Mary said to them, "Oh, you don't need to read to me about Jesus. I already saw him." And they said, "Oh, where?" And she said, "When you brought me here, and you treated me like your own daughter, and you treated me like I've never done anything wrong." And Josephine wrote in her husband's memoir that they never said anything to the girls about their past. They never mentioned the word sin to them. My husband and I always felt that human kindness and loving action should come first and come last. Only one thing ever brings about our best selves, and that is love. And we can almost stop there with Josephine's story, and it's a powerful enough story as it is, but there's one more chapter in her life, and that I think is important to hear, and it was challenging for me to hear. So in 1864, the English Parliament passed the Contagious Diseases Act, and this was an act that declared that within the radius of army camps and naval ports, every woman who was suspected of being a prostitute or having sexual relations with any of the army personnel, they were to be registered, and they were to be given an internal exam to determine if they had contagious diseases, an STD. And if they did, then they were detained for 3 to 6 months. Now, if they refused to be registered or refused to be examined, they also were detained for 3 to 6 months. And the aim, according to Parliament, was to curb the spread of diseases in the military ranks. Not surprisingly, this didn't go over too well with Josephine and many other men and women who could not believe that this had passed. And the men in the military were given a pass, and the women that they used were being forcibly examined, and they were bearing the burden of the sin of that act, these already outcast women. Now, Josephine knew it would decimate her husband's career if she took this on, and she knew she would be shunned, and she struggled with this choice. She wrote in her journal, "It is now many weeks since I knew that Parliament had sanctioned this great wickedness, and I have not yet put on my armor, nor am I yet ready. Nothing wears me out, body and soul, as anger, fruitless anger, and this thing fills me with such an anger that I fear to face it." But she eventually prayed that God would turn her anger into a well-governed hatred against injustice and tyranny and cruelty. She was angry on behalf of no name, no consequence people who were being dealt with as things, not as people. And this is what injustice and tyranny and cruelty are. They are not seeing others for the value that they have in being created by a living God, in the image of God, to have life abundantly. Josephine struggled with this decision to take this on publicly. Her husband struggled with it too, but eventually they came to this point where he fully supported her, and she did eventually respond. And with many other people, she started a society. They started writing, they started organizing, they started speaking out against this act, and she was very good at it. She was also called many names. I just draw your attention to this. I love this. It's a handbill. It appears like he's afraid to meet us. Therefore, Mrs. Butler is calling everybody to this one place, and they're going to talk about it. So I guess Mr. Childers said he was for the repealment of the law, but then voted a different way in Parliament, and she's calling him out on it publicly. So I like to refer to this as a 1870 version of a Twitter takedown, where very publicly people know where she stands. She was good at this kind of work, but she was demeaned in the Parliament, where on the parliamentary record it's written, an MP stood up and said, "Surely Mrs. Josephine Butler must be unpleasing to her husband. No man would want such a woman who spoke about this in public." The Queen Victoria's son-in-law, Prince Leopold, he said that Josephine was the most beautiful woman in the world, but she has done herself a great harm by violently taking up a subject which had better be left alone. She was even censured by Charles Spurgeon. He was a famous preacher at the time, in a letter stating that godly people don't involve themselves with sinners in this matter. But she, along with many others, they kept at it, and eventually, almost 20 years later, in 1889, English Parliament repealed that law. So my question, when I read stories like Josephine's, is why? Why did she take this course of action? She did not need to. She was fine. If she never paid attention to this issue, her life would have been exactly the same. Why did she do this? And the short answer is Jesus. Like the Sunday school answer, Jesus. In multiple places, Josephine writes of the typical acts of Christ, the dangerous leveler. She referred to Jesus in this way often. She writes about how Jesus interacted with women. Jesus did not condemn the woman dragged out and caught in adultery. He did not condemn the weeping prostitute kissing his feet. He did not condemn Mary at the tomb. He called her name. He did not recoil from the bleeding woman. In fact, he looked right at her with curiosity and kindness. He offered the outcast woman at the well conversation, dignity, and living water. And the text says he saw her whole life, and that somehow changed that woman in the moment. In an article Josephine wrote for the Cosmopolitan Review in 1870, she wrote, quoting Jesus from Matthew 25, "I was hungry and thirsty, naked, sick, and in prison, and ye came not unto me." In simple words such as these, the eternal excommunication runs, and when we ask him where it may have been that we saw him in so sad a case, shall he not answer, "Here"? For who like these are hungry and thirsty, who stripped as these and robbed of all the adorning raiment of womanhood? She went on. The wrong complained of is simply this, that a world professing the religion of Christ has failed to act towards fallen women as Christ required of it. And this is the lens of Christ. This is the lens that Josephine saw the world through, and through which she acted in the world as a Christ follower. One of Butler's favorite scriptures was from Genesis 16, and it's the story of Hagar. And she wrote about it extensively in a book she wrote called The Lady of Shunem. We're going to read that story from Genesis now together. And notice what Josephine noticed about that story. And hopefully as you hear it, you will hear God's word for you as well. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. And he slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Now the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." And that is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, well of the living one who sees me. Now, there are many ways that this passage has been interpreted over the years of church history. In the Middle Ages, it was very much spiritualized and seen as an allegory. So Sarai represents the believing church, the church called to do God's work, and Hagar represents the other, the world, that you should run away from. During the Reformation, some of the reformers, I won't say who, read it and saw cautionary tales from the women. So Sarai was an unfaithful and unbelieving when she took matters into her own hands instead of believing God's promise. And Hagar was ungrateful, and she was refusing to take her punishment from Sarai for despising her mistress. I guess being a slave and forced to have someone else's baby should make you feel grateful. But what Josephine did differently when she read through this passage through the lens of an incarnated life of Christ, the life spent talking with and lifting up the outcast and the leper and the prostitute as part and parcel of his new kingdom that his death and resurrection brought. With Josephine, when we read with this Jesus hermeneutic, we read this text as if the outcast was important, as if Hagar was important to God. When we read the text, the first thing we notice is the naming. Sarai and Abraham do not name this slave. They just refer to her as the slave or your slave. They do not use her name. But when she is cast out without resource, pregnant and alone, Jehovah, the God of the universe, he says her name. Hagar, where are you coming from and where are you going? Hagar is seen in her shame, in her choicelessness, in her despair. And God instructs her to go back to her mistress. And that might seem puzzling and unclear maybe to us why. But what is clear in this passage is Hagar's response to God. She, a despised slave, in response to God's attention, she names the God of the universe. She named him, "You are the God who sees me. I now see the one who sees me." The first instance of a woman naming God in the Bible is Hagar. You are the God who sees me, and this me being this lowest and smallest, most significant used up body. Now, when Josephine read Hagar, she saw the women in front of her in the oakum cellar. She saw her friend Mary, who had died in her home. She saw hundreds of women being detained for their lives, having taken a turn that they did not choose. And she saw herself holding her dying child. And she could say to those women who had had those experiences of violence, of unasked for pregnancy, of watching their children die, feeling helpless, and she could say, God sees you, for God saw Hagar. Josephine writes, "Is it not a thought, a fact which should wake up the whole Christian world to a truer, clearer view of life as it is around us, that the first record of a direct communication from Jehovah to a woman is this meeting with the rejected Hagar, alone in the wilderness? Hagar, the ill-used slave, this should wake up the whole Christian world," Josephine wrote. She read her Bible and she saw a story where God met her and where God met Hagar, a story where God meets all the Hagars of the world. And then she acted out of that story, even at great personal cost. And that makes me ask myself the question, what story am I living out of? Now, Josephine's story is remarkable. It's incredible, really. And I don't want you to feel like I'm saying that we should all start shelters in our houses and bringing homeless people home to our homes and fighting the government if we want to be good Christians like Josephine. That's not exactly what I'm saying. That was Josephine's story. But each one of us will be called to name a kind of injustice and act to amend it in different ways. And that's how God's going to do his work, right? So I think her story offers parts that maybe we can identify with in our own journey. So maybe you identify with the part of her story where she's starting to suspect things are not right, but she's being told to not rock the boat. Or maybe you, like her, have experienced a deep, very deep pain, and it's let you see anew the pain of the world. Maybe your deepest pain is being redeemed into something healing and with great meaning. Maybe you and the place you have in the world are being asked to speak out and to take action about something, and you're not ready to do that yet. And maybe you are actively working and speaking, and it is hard, and you're being misunderstood. Wherever you are, I hope you can say this Sunday, I have now seen the one who sees me. I hope that you hear that this story about Josephine's life and Hagar's life is about God's indomitable love for you and for every creation of his. So kingdom justice, we've been talking about justice, is about valuing each person like a pearl of great price, no matter what value the world puts on them. There is no one person worth less in our world. And in the middle of, we hear it on the news, the violence and wars. Closer to home, our culture wars, our economic arguments, our political anger and the meanness on all sides. In the middle of broken families and legacies, generational abuse and racism and bureaucracies that maybe try but often are careless. There are real people with real lives being caught there, and they're longing to be seen and heard. Biblical justice is always about how we see and then how we act. So true religion, the book of James says, is taking care of the widow and the poor, treating them with dignity and humanity. Those are the works James is talking about when he talks about faith and works. You need both. Doing what God requires of us is this: loving mercy, doing justice, walking humbly, the prophet Micah says. The only fast and sacrifice that God cares about, Isaiah writes in chapter 58, is taking care of the widow and the poor, championing their cause. Getting into the kingdom, Jesus says, is a matter of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the forgotten as if they were him. Fulfilling all the law, Jesus says, is loving the person, any person you come across every day, as much as we love ourselves. Doing justice is a command from our God over and over, because it is what love looks like in public. So maybe you will be called to working for justice in public policy through the structures our democracy has, and maybe not. Maybe you will be called to just act justly to the people, to your neighbors on the street, in your school, in your kids' school, maybe at the cubicle next to you. My daughter, have you seen, sometimes you're at a light and there's people at the light with signs that say I'm homeless, and they walk up and down the lines of traffic. And a few months ago, my daughter, we were there, someone was walking and I didn't make eye contact. And he had the sign, I'm homeless, and my daughter's like, why aren't you helping him? I was like, well, because we should give money to the shelters and to the programs, and that would be the better way. And she said, but wouldn't it be better if you treated him like a person instead of pretending he didn't exist? Yep, that would be better. And it, like in that moment, that 8-year-old kid, in that moment, I was like, yeah, no, that is the goal. I can give my money any way I want, but I need to treat this person as a person in this moment. And so now we have granola bars in the front seat of the car, and I unroll my window every time I see someone. I say, hi, how was your day? Would you like a granola bar? And that's fine, and that's easy. But it's treating someone. Maybe you will be called to act in justice close to home. There are as many ways to work for justice as there are people here in this room. And while we can converse about how to best do it for others, we can never not be oriented from doing justice for others. In Reformed theology, which is what the road sits in, justice and service, they are not things that we do to be nice to people so that they will come to church and come to know God. That's not why we do them. Nor are they things we do to merit being loved by God. Serving and living justly, advocating for the justice for others, is the natural outflow of us being reoriented towards God. We experience grace, we experience wholeness, we experience community as a result of being called by Jesus, the dangerous leveler. So then we actively work, and we actively might even have to fight for that grace and wholeness and community for others as well. Justice is not just for activists. It is every Christian's, I love you too, Father. So, here is the call. I think the call from these last 3 months that we've spent sitting in what it means to do justice here in our city as the Road Church. And at the end of all this talk on justice is the call to see things differently wherever we are. We have been called to radical hospitality, to inviting others who might not be a thing like us into our space and getting to know them. We have been called to see justice and joy coming together in kinship. We've been called to see this woman, as Mel said, see that woman anointing Jesus' feet as Jesus saw her. We've been called to see Jesus as standing in a long line of prophets calling out judgment on those who talk a good game but leave real people hurt in the dust. We've been called to imagine the world God imagines, the kingdom he is bringing. And we are called to eat with the people Jesus ate with. We are called to not humiliate those who have less than us by forgetting them. We are called to read the story of Hagar with the Hagars of the world. We are called to read the hundreds of passages about welcoming the stranger and welcoming the refugee, along with the strangers and refugees in our midst, with the orphans and the widows and the imprisoned and the forgotten of our world. Let's read anew those passages in our scriptures about how God drops everything to find one and bring them close. And I think us at The Road, I think we're called to tell the story and to be good storytellers and tell stories about this love, the love that sees all of us holy and whole in his sight, and that we're called to do some true religion. Let's pray. God, sometimes talking about justice, it feels heavy. And maybe some of that weight is that it is time to talk about it. And you are the one who sees us. And I pray that you would help reveal to us where you have seen us and where you have been with us, and then help us to pass that forward to the people around us, to see them as you see them. Help us to act. Help us open our ears to where we need to hear your invitation on where to act, where to do love in public. We thank you for your grace. We thank you how you meet us. We thank you for this community as we ask the hard questions and we do this together. Thank you, and we love you. In the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, amen.